This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Professor Mark Noll his latest book, In the Beginning Was the Word, The Bible in American Public Life, 1492 to 1783. Mark Noll is the Francis A. McEnany Professor of History at the University of Notre Dame. It is fair to say that he is the great historian of Protestant Christianity in the United States. He's the author of more than 20 books, including America's God, From Jonathan Edwards to Abraham Lincoln, and also a book that was important to me, The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, published in 1994. Mark Noll, welcome to the program.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
So, Mark, thinking about the title of your book, obviously pulled from famous opening of the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word, is your book arguing that the Bible is the or a foundation point of American culture?
Well, certainly it's a foundation point and a very important foundation point. What keeps me back from saying it's the foundation is simply the historical reality that holy scriptures, and this would be true for the Quran and religious books of other religions, holy scriptures are always embedded in culture. So I think I might say something like certain themes from the Bible as appropriated by influential early Americans were definitive. Now, that's not a pithy, direct answer to your pithy, direct question.
Yeah. So, but thinking about, I mean, you write about it. Interesting. You start with Christopher Columbus as being,
right.
The first European who brings the scriptures to America, and brings them also in the form of, seeing himself as some sort of prophet, and scripture kind of informs his own self-understanding. I thought that was interesting. But of course, really what you're concerned about in the book is North America and the bringing of the Bible to North America. Yet you spend the first, 100 pages of the book talking about England, and how, and also Martin Luther and the shaping of Protestantism in Europe, and how that will then impact the bringing of the Bible and the use of the Bible in colonial America. So maybe we'll talk about the British contribution there. And how that impacts our story. So we've got, and then also something interwoven throughout your book, biblicism versus Christendom. And also, and that also figures heavily, obviously, from the British inheritance of our colonists. Right.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the Catholic introduction, and it really is a kind of preface, because it is an important historical fact that the first really serious Bible promoters in even what becomes North America were Catholic. Now, the timing of that early promotion explains naturally why the story later becomes very Protestant, because the early Catholic bringing of the scriptures to the Americas was before Protestantism existed. And then, of course, as you indicate, what does have such a strong impact upon North America is not just Protestantism, but British Protestantism. So the reason for starting the book with Martin Luther, starting the main portion after Columbus and Bartolome de las Casas and Bishop Zumarraga in Mexico are done, the reason for starting with Martin Luther and early Protestantism is because that approach to religion, and particularly that approach to Christianity and the Bible, has a tremendous impact in Britain at the time that Britain becomes the great promoter of colonization in North America. So, for better and for worse, what are the founding cultures as well as the founding colonies of North America, what becomes the United States, come from Britain at a time when it has become Protestant, a lot of controversy, different varieties of Protestantism contending with each other, but all of them militantly anti-Catholic, all of them associating the truth of Protestant Christianity with civil liberty and in opposition to what they see as the errors of Catholicism. So when the colonies are founded that eventually become the United States, they are founded as an extension of British culture. And in that British culture, a Protestant variation of Christendom is dominant. And Christendom just means an approach to life in which all aspects of society, all spheres of existence are interwoven underneath some kind of general Christian framework. One of the misconceptions of the Protestant Reformation that's frequently abroad is that Protestantism changed everything. Well, it didn't. Protestantism changed the center of gravity in religious teaching, but almost all of the main Protestant movements in Europe were like the Catholic countries, Catholic nations, in organizing all of life around their vision of Christianity. So if you were a Catholic in Protestant Germany, you either had to shut up or leave. If you were a Catholic in Scotland or England after the Protestant Reformation, you had to shut up or leave. So there was an organization of all of society around this notion of integrating everything. And of course, almost everybody in Europe believed that God was in charge of everything. One of the interesting developments that took place in England particularly was the rise of Christian Protestant groups who began to challenge Christendom, who said that Protestant organization of society that tries to manage everything is infected with the same kind of problems that Catholic Europe had been infected with. And so the remedy was to turn back to the pure source of religion, the Bible alone, to turn back to the pure source of religion as a way of reforming societies that had retained a great deal of the corruption when the Catholic Church was in charge. So in England, and it's not just in England, but for American purposes, what happens in England is important. In England, there grows up a minority. It's a very small minority at first, becomes a little bit larger in the 17th century, that says, when we trust the Bible, we have to throw over this system that's organized everything as Christendom. The main Church of England authorities in Britain said, no. We support the Bible, and the Bible is what helps us organize all of our society, law, monarchy, the universities. The Bible is our book. When we come to America, things begin to get much more complicated because the small minority that said the Bible stands against Christendom has a much bigger place in the colonies, even though the first colonies in the South, Virginia, and then Massachusetts, the first major colonies, do carry over the Christendom model. I'm trying to put too many things on the table at once here, I think.
Yeah.
But the important thing is the inheritance from Britain is Protestant, but with a contention. What kind of Protestant? Protestant where the Bible supports the standing order, Christendom, or where the Bible challenges the standing order. When we get to America, we get figures like Roger Williams, who in many ways is just a Puritan in his theology, but he thinks the Bible stands over against and criticizes and condemns the organization of society as it has been organized in Europe time out of mind.
With a contribution of the Puritans to America, you used the term, I thought was interesting, Bible commonwealths.
Right.
And maybe you could talk more about that. But just a different question that comes to my mind is if, in particular, thinking about the book, your argument about the Bible in American life, and yet the colonies themselves are their own entities, their own separate, political entities,
right.
And also so you have the southern colonies, the middle colonies, and the New England colonies with various degrees of religious intensity and fervor. And it's almost with your book, this is something I wanted to, was thinking about as I'm reading it. It's almost as if you're saying to understand the Bible in American life, it's the Puritan settlement that matters the most, that it's almost the one that informs the entire colonial interpretation or colonial use of the Bible. And I don't know if I read you wrong there, but I wanted to get your reaction to that take of your book, which seems also, in certain respects, to coincide with Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, who really rejects, say, the Declaration of Independence or the written Constitution as formative of the American order, and says no, it's the Puritans, it's the liberty that comes out of the Puritans, and he talks about that early in the book.
Right. Tocqueville's really quite interesting because when he does his genealogy for what he thinks he's describing in the early 1830s, he really does begin with New England Puritans and carries things right through from that originating basis. It's not a real good historical account, but it fits what he wants to say about the nature of democracy. Yes, the way in which Puritanism, I think, really did shape all of what came later in America, the colonies, and then the nation, can be, I think, categorized in two or three ways. One was the sense of the people as an entity being in a special relationship with God. They use the word covenant, so promises between the Maker and the people and God. This was a very common notion in European Christian countries, Catholic and Protestant. It's imported into the North American colonies most strongly in Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire, New Haven colonies. And it becomes, in the mid and later 18th century, taken up by all of the colonies. So one of the fascinating things about studying the place of the Bible in the whole colonial period is that you get ministers from the middle colonies who do not have that same intense, organized Christian character as Massachusetts, and then representatives in the southern colonies, where you have a kind of mini Anglican establishment, they begin to talk about the colonies as having this special covenantal relationship with God. So there's a Puritan element. Another Puritan element is the dedication of the New Englanders to print the life of the mind, to verbally articulating what they're about. If you look at the records of published material in colonial America, even though the New England colonies represent only really a fraction of the population, maybe 20 to 25% of the population, they're responsible for 60 to 70% of the books and the articles. A lot of them are sermons, some of them are not sermons, but you have a kind of cultural, what should we call it, intellectual, literary weight for New England is much, much stronger than anywhere else in the country. So in that regard, too. Now, reservation. In the 18th century, as I try to spell out in the book, I think that the distinctly Puritan Christian emphasis recedes as all of the colonies are drawn more tightly into the British Empire. This is, I think, a real significant development of scholarship over the last 20 years. People like my colleague at Notre Dame, Patrick Griffin, McConville from Boston, and several other historians have shown that the colonists become more and more British, particularly during the imperial wars. So the King George's War, the French and Indian War, you find colonists from New England, but also New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Georgia, talking about Britain as special in God's plan for the world. So you have what begins from New England as a special sense of God's people, and therefore the Bible is a special way to understand what's happening, I think expanding and even in some ways being transformed in the middle of the 18th century into a British sense of chosenness, where the Bible is subordinated to the imperial aims of Britain. An element from the past that reinforces this is a very strong anti-Catholicism that is directed against France, particularly, Spain a little bit, directed against France particularly, and France is depicted almost always in these imperial wars against Britain as the source of tyranny, of infidelity, of the loss of human dignity, whereas Britain, not just New England, but not just the colonies, but Britain is the source of Protestant truth, the Bible, liberty. And that transformation of the 18th century, the way in which the American colonies are drawn closer and closer into the ideology of a British sort of divine mandate for the world, that becomes very important. And that, I think, kind of undercuts some of the distinctly Puritan and certainly distinctly theological use of the Bible that came out of the 17th century. So by the time we get to the break with Britain, many of the people who are charging Britain with tyranny are saying that they are merely defending what have been British traditional rights that now Britain is violating.
Oh, that's
And you get the very strange charges by people, and this is fairly widespread in the colonists. They say, well, Britain pretends to be Protestant, but really we know that they're just like the Catholics because they are attacking our liberty and they are oppressing us and showing that they're tyrannical.
So what is that? I mean, let's think about that for a minute in the wider course of your book. So does that mean that the Bible commonwealths, these settlements, as they take shape, is there something about Puritanism and intense Bible reading and the layman being given charge of Scripture and the way you talk about these congregations? Yes, the pastor was preeminent in those congregations, but the laymen were to hold him account and make sure that he was preaching correctly from the Scriptures. Is there something about all of that either was it already not successful, not working, or is it the case that it's sort of prone to being subsumed under politics, like the British Empire? And I can just think of some reasons why that might be the case. So what do you make of that?
Right, those are really good questions, and they hinge in some sense on an evaluation of what a strongly Protestant approach to religion in the Bible and a strongly Protestant approach to public life can do and not do. And I say, I'm a Protestant and assume that I'm going to die a Protestant, but it does seem to me that there are some real strengths balanced by some real weaknesses. The strengths include the Protestant notion of the priesthood of all believers. There is not, in theory, a special clerical class that's going to mediate the Scriptures to the laity, but in principle, the laity are responsible for understanding the Bible for themselves. And one of the very positive results of that understanding is tremendous energy and initiative, and often commendable initiative in people who are marginalized in society. So one of the chapters of the book focuses upon the way in which the Bible becomes alive for African Americans, many of them were slaves, in a new way that simply hadn't taken place in any part of Christendom before that. That's the positive. The negative is that where you're asking everybody to read and interpret the Bible for themselves, sometimes they actually do, which means that coherence is always a problem, and it was a problem in Massachusetts in the mid-1630s. So John Winthrop and the first settlers came to Massachusetts, breathed a huge sigh of relief. They were finally away from corrupt Britain. They could finally organize the way the things they knew the Bible said. And here's a lay woman, Anne Hutchinson, and here's another minister, Roger Williams, who said, wait, that's not right. You've misconstrued the way that the Bible has told us to organize things. So immediately, within 5 years, you've got this holy commonwealth that's got the problems of internal dissent. Now, what I think makes things more unified than a simply Protestant world would have led to are these imperial developments in the 18th century. And also the other great events of the 18th century, which you haven't mentioned yet, were the evangelical revivals that brought a new emphasis to the Bible, not as a civic book, but as a religious book. And the great figure there is George Whitefield, who is a Church of England clergyman, but who preaches a message of new birth, of spiritual regeneration, that really is non-discriminatory. And he preaches to everybody. He gets in trouble with Church of England colleagues because he says Baptists are just as good as Anglicans, and black people are just as capable of understanding God's love as white people. So there is a kind of democratizing effect of the revival and an application of the Bible into marginalized people where it hadn't existed before. And I would see this as a positive aspect of Protestantism. But then also there is really a loss of the civic function, and it's the power of allegiance to the British Empire, much more than anything religious, that constrains and keeps in check the inherent Protestant tendency for things just to become fragmented and chaotic. So, going back to your very earliest question, is the Bible the key element in what comes in America? Well, yes, but always in a certain historical context where there are many other elements and other influences, factors coming into play as well.
So it sounds like what you're saying, if I heard you correctly, is the sort of centrifugal tendencies within Protestantism in the colonies, in the North American colonies, are held together by politics.
Yes, and I would say in the 18th century.
So does that mean there's an enthronement of politics? And people have said this about the Protestant Reformation, is it tended to enthrone the state in certain respects? Is that what I hear you be saying? It's interesting.
I agree with the variation of that, and the proof of the pudding comes in the Revolutionary period when the Bible is enlisted for the patriot cause and is very persuasive amongst the patriots, even though, and I think any kind of objective analysis, those few loyalists who brought the Bible into the public sphere in the mid-1770s had, by an academic assessment, just as good arguments on the basis of Scripture, or even better arguments than did those who were using the Bible to support the break with Britain. And Tom Paine's Common Sense is a great example, and the tract that really, published in early 1776, moved the colonists from just being upset with Britain to thinking that monarchy itself was a huge evil. Paine takes a major section of his tract to tell the story from the Old Testament of the people of Israel come to the prophet Samuel and say, we want a king like the neighboring states, neighboring organizations. Samuel says, I'm sure the Lord doesn't want that. And then the Lord speaks to the prophet Samuel and says, you people do this, you're in big trouble. And Paine says, this passage shows us that monarchy is evil. And there's really good scholarship in the last, even in 10 years, to show that argument drawn specifically from the Bible was crucial in breaking the loyalty of these very intensely British colonists from their monarch. There were Church of England ministers who said, wait a minute. What about all the other portions of Scripture that say honor the emperor, the powers that be that are ordained by God, even passages in the Old Testament where the Lord allows Israel to have a king. But those arguments are just swept away. And so back to your question, does the state replace a kind of authoritative, interpretive decision-making such as the church exercise? In some ways, yes. Now, my own sense is that phenomenon takes place mostly at times of crisis. The revival periods of the 1740s and 1750s, I think, show something quite different, and that's a populist, effective communication, almost democratic, of Scripture that really is, if it's not unpolitical, it's apolitical. It's probably not anti-political, but it certainly is, because George Whitefield actually was quite a strong defender of the British Empire. But it's apolitical, and the Scriptures have an effect with particularly marginalized members of society, women, slaves, in some cases even Native Americans, that doesn't really have anything to do with politics, or at least as we think of it today.
In the question, thinking about the revolution, you were talking about Thomas Paine and certain loyalists. How did those breaking, how was it used in the revolution amongst those seeking independence? And I'm thinking here of what our earlier discussion of the Puritans, understanding ecclesiology being subordinated to empire, and I'm assuming then that it would be subordinated to the rising American nationhood, although probably not fair to say American nationhood yet, but that rising sense of independence, of united independence amongst the colonies. How do you find it being used in that circumstance?
Yeah, I don't think I would say it's being used in defense of a united colonies
or just the overall project of independence.
Yeah,
That's what I mean.
I think what comes through most clearly in the things were actually the sermons that were preached, which is a lot, but then also in the use of Bible images and even in some cases Bible argument by lay people. What comes through is the support for the ideology that leads to independence. So the picture of the monarch as corrupt and of the Parliament as corrupt and therefore leading on to tyranny. Now, just as a parenthesis, that way of seeing things has a long secular, well, not particularly religious root in John Locke and then the civic humanists and the Republican thinkers who had a theory of the accumulation of power as always being dangerous. One of the things I tried to do in this book, and I've tried to do in other books, is show how that small R Republican and then a Protestant biblicism merged pretty seriously in the 1740s, 50s, and 60s, and so we're around in the Revolutionary period. But what leaders of the Patriots were able to do is to use biblical imagery powerfully to oppose what they saw as British tyranny. So you have what has to be seen as a really strange result of when the Continental Congress says we need an image for the United States. They strike a committee that includes Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, who are not by any means what we would say Orthodox evangelical Bible believers. That they both have a certain respect for the Bible, but it's of the Enlightenment. They propose as the great seal of the United States an image of the children of Israel being led across the Red Sea, the Red Sea, and the troops of Pharaoh, standing for the British, being destroyed by an act of God. So they take this miraculous story from the Hebrew Scriptures, from the Old Testament, and say this is what the United States or the United Colonies is all about. And these are not people that you think of immediately as the hardcore Bible believers in the 1770s, but they're able to use the biblical material. And then you get a serious, much more serious Protestants, Sam Adams from Massachusetts, for example, who will author general statements from the Continental Congress that interweaves what we today think of as kind of Lockean or Republican political theory right in with an appeal to Jesus, to quoting from the Psalms, quoting from the New Testament. And this combination of Bible reliance, an image of what's good and bad in politics, are just one and the same things. And so these poor loyalists, they say, well look, don't the Apostle Paul say on multiple occasions, honor the emperor, pray for those who are in power, don't try to push back, and of course that way of interpreting the Bible just gets nowhere.
Yeah.
So it's the ideology, I would think, that really explains, in some sense, a very Protestant use of the Bible, but in some sense, a very 18th century British use of the Bible.
So when we talk about these public arguments, I mean, these sermons you might hear, I mean, is that, in a way, it would seem to have a limited appeal because of the proof texting and the fact that we're relying on interpretations that would be unique to various religious communities themselves. Yeah. So what really would matter might be natural rights or things that appeal
Yeah.
across the colonies.
Well, yes. Although I wouldn't phrase it that way. I wouldn't say. I don't think it's possible to see a foundational layer of something onto which then you have a superstructure of something else. So, and traditionally in some Christian communities, you said, well, you've got the foundational layer of the trust in the Bible, and then you have on top Locke or civic humanism or something. I think these were so intimately interwoven for the colonists who favored independence that they just are inseparable, which is why I believe both political argumentation saying, well, of course, Parliament's made a mistake, but they're not really out to. There's no conspiracy there to wipe out colonial privileges, and that argument goes nowhere. And then these not very many, there aren't very many, but then these loyalist use of the Bible to say, look, Scripture doesn't promote any kind of rebellion. And you got there are even a few. And these are really interesting people. You have a few patriots who agree that Britain is abusing the colonists, and it's time to throw over what they always call the tyranny of Parliament. But then who say, look, we are right in thinking that Parliament desires to enslave the colonists, but aren't we doing something even worse by enslaving African Americans? If natural law, if human rights, if the main teachings of the Bible justify our breaking from Britain, they justify even more attacking this, and then they would use a series of words, sinful, unnatural, inhuman system of slavery. And those arguments actually have a little bit of currency in the 1770s on into the early 1790s, but then actually the solidification of the United States as a nation and the need to have a unified states that include the slave states and then include the northerners who make money off the slaves. And I mean, that argument stays. Yeah. But it's a really interesting application of what I would again call this interwoven biblical and natural rights picture of the world. It was so influential in the second half of the 18th century.
Well, thinking here also as I read your book, I mean, and I know you don't address this directly in your book, but yet it seems to just inevitably come out of it, and that's the controversy over American exceptionalism.
Yeah.
And you do spend time talking about the model of Christian charity, which you note was a sermon, either given
right.
on shore or actually given in a boat. We don't actually know.
Right.
And then someone suggested, was it even actually delivered to the community? But you know that's where the famously we have this phrase: "We will be a city on a hill to the world if we live rightly."
Right. The eyes of all people are upon us.
The eyes of all people are upon us. So, but talk about there's a tension in your book. I mean, and really the whole structure of your book would seem to suggest, you know, if we move towards so the Puritan Bible commonwealths don't exactly pan out. But what's the legacy there? Maybe the legacy is biblicism and intense religious reading and prayer and fervor and intense religious communities. That's part of our legacy. But yet inevitably that'll have public consequences of some kind. So I mean, just think about the tendency and how that would actually contribute to an idea of an exceptional nation, inevitably so, versus saying. Just with the outright condemnation. I mean, because one could, as a Christian, easily just condemn the idea of American exceptionalism as being hubristic. But yeah, I'm curious to get your thoughts on that whole thicket of issues.
Yeah, I'm sure we can thrash this out in less than 3 or 4 hours today, right? But, well, that made you draw attention to the John Winthrop sermon, and it is a sermon, but it's also a lay sermon. I think that's very significant. The model of Christian charity, which he uses a lot of references from the Hebrew Scriptures, a lot of references from the New Testament to explain that, and taking the phrase from the Sermon on the Mount, we will be a people on a hill, a city on a hill. Now, some really good scholarship, including a young literature historian from Washington University of St. Louis, Abram Van Ingen, who has pointed out what others have also pointed out, that Winthrop it just cannot be considered to have in mind
Oh, yeah.
the anything like what becomes the nation of the United States. What the better scholarship is showing is he's really talking about a pattern of social and church reorganization that he sees having an outpost in New England, but then also alive in Britain, Scotland, England, Scotland, a few places on the continent where God's people, and they're the exceptional ones. Well, over the course of American history, God's people, defined in really strong theological terms and explicit religious language, begins to transform to the people living in this place. And I actually think that it's in the 1740s and 50s where you get the strong English-French warfare with this extreme language about the tyrannical Catholic Louis XIV, Louis XV, Louis XVI, and then the freedom-loving Britons, that what had been Winthrop's effort to describe a certain group of late Protestant Christians becomes a description of the nation. And that then leads on to the sense of American moral exceptionalism. My own way as a historian of dealing with this question is to divide it between what people thought, what was true empirically, and then what might be evaluated morally. Certainly, in the colonial period, American colonists thought the British Empire was specially chosen by God. Certainly, during the 1770s, actually on to the Constitution, a lot of Americans thought that the new United States had a special relationship with God. Again, I'm sort of laughing because Benjamin Franklin, quasi-skeptic, 2 or 3 times in his old age, in the 1780s, just before he dies, makes these kind of claims. So if people like Franklin do it, then those who are real, serious Bible believers can sometimes do it even more. And then, empirically considered, the American experiment really is, in the 18th and even on in the 19th century, really is exceptional. There are very, very few places. There's some analogies to Holland. There's some analogies to the Swiss Confederation. But what becomes the United States is really exceptional in the world in thinking that you can have a free public space where you don't need Christendom to ensure, you don't need the interweaving of religion and government to ensure social well-being, but you're going to leave the prospect for social well-being to the voluntary action of the community acting on its own steam. That really is exceptional. Now, it leads to, there's some morally questionable things because part of that process is the continuation and eventually the strengthening of the slave system. It's a process that leads to the treatment of natives and other marginalized people as if they don't count as humans, which are things that certainly biblical religion is against. So there is that empirical exceptionalism. But then there's the moral question, the theological question. Is the United States, in some sense, chosen by God for a mission in the world? And here, speaking not as a historian, but as a Protestant Christian, I think that statement is pretty close to a heretical statement because, in my view of the Christian scriptures, God's people are those throughout the whole world who have a trust in Jesus. And it actually is as one of the prominent ministers in the 1790s said, the distinction of Israel is at an end. But that moral or theological evaluation is really very different from trying to see seriously what the people at the time thought, and then also trying to objectively compare what's happening in what becomes the United States and what's happening in the rest of the world. And on those terms, American exceptionalism, I think, is you can talk about it objectively and with some degree of certainty. So That's, again, a simplified answer to a complicated question, but a really good one.
No, I think too, just listening to you, expound what I think is an Orthodox Christian understanding of the people of God. How did the Puritans think, though, about the enlargement of their community? Was it, you think about those who go to Plymouth or Massachusetts Bay, do they? Is this closed, or is it? I mean, are they theoretically open to whomever might join them as long as they subscribe to the proper theological tenets?
In theory, it's wide open. So, as it is actually in Virginia, where the one of the early emblems of the colony Virginia is an outreach to natives and saying, here's the benefits we hope to give to you. In New England, there is, in theory, an openness to evangelize the Native Americans. There is no particular theoretical barrier to non-English people coming, but in practice, it's a pretty closed society. In practice, you have to be not just a Christian, you have to be not just a Protestant Christian, you have to be not just a Reformed Protestant Christian, but you got to be a Reformed Protestant Christian who believes that the particular framing of Christian theology and theology in relationship to society that propels this separatist or non-separating English Puritan group to the New World. So there's some sponsorship of missionaries to Indians. John Eliot is known as the apostle to the Indians, and he is a self-sacrificing minister, but there are more incidents where we would today say cultural clash leads to brutal dispossession, brutal massacres. You have ministers who otherwise good standing, Thomas Shepard of Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the 1630s, speaking of the divine slaughter of the Indians. Well, I mean, basically what you have to conclude as a historian is that they were like us. Yeah. And our ideals are one thing, but our practice needs to be evaluated pretty soberly on the other hand.
Yeah. What I always think about, in thinking about, say, the model of Christian charity and thinking about the Puritans and sort of their, the way that sort of rich theological inheritance just gets unpacked and turns into other forms of meaning. And when I read the model of Christian charity, of course, this is what it is. It's a sermon.
Yeah.
The question though becomes politics, meaning, civic order.
Right.
Takes these themes, takes these symbols, and appropriates them in ways not intended by the speaker. And so the historian's craft, in a way, I've always thought is limited here.
Yeah.
What comes to matter is, so just like. So the Puritan community would be theoretically open to anyone. Well, America itself politically is theoretically open to anyone, as long as you accept the creed, the declaration.
Right, and then what I'm working on right now is kind of carrying the story into the 19th century, and you see that the profession of openness, but if you're a Catholic and object to the use of the King James Bible for your students in tax-supported schools, then there's going to be a fracas. There's going to be a rush. I will say the one point that encouraged me as a Protestant in the study of this colonial period, and I really did not. This was something that came out of the research. Is I thought that where people were most ardently biblical and did not have their hands on the reins of power, you really get a different. You just have to have a different conclusion or evaluation. So the African Americans or African Britons in some case who become serious Christians in the 1760s, 70s, and 80s really don't use the Bible for much civic purpose. It's a liberating word without much politics because these people have no chance to be politically influential. And you have some Quaker voices, you have some women, you have some others who really don't have any power, who, in my view, are the exemplary examples of people for whom the Bible becomes important, and they do not then go on to try to constrain others to do what they have concluded are the necessary things to do.
Yeah. No, that's well stated. Although I suppose it will be generations later that we will see Black Americans use the Bible to vindicate essential claims.
Right.
Thank you so much, Mark, for your time today, and for talking about your excellent new book. Jody Bottom, in a review of the book in the Claremont Review of Books, says that we are in the field of a master scholar when we read this book. And as I read your book, I concluded he was right. It is just an incredible collection of resources, scholarship, analysis, and we're in your debt. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, and thank you for taking time to read it and talk about it.
All right, I appreciate it. This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.